Well, good morning. We begin a new series today called Bridges, and our first session is Crossing the Red Sea, and it takes the scripture from Exodus, the 14th chapter, the story of the Israelite people and crossing the Red Sea. But before I get to that, I wanted to say in the comments 2 weeks ago, Jane had commented about watching the video with her grandson who's going through confirmation class. Jane, I appreciate your comments and for your grandson, and I hope it was beneficial for him and his journey through confirmation. And I look forward to hearing any comments or questions that you all might have as you listen to the things that we talk about here. The story picks up in the 10th verse of Exodus. The background is that Moses has been sent by God to the Israelite people in captivity, in prison really, in Egypt, been made slaves, and to rescue the people and bring them back to the promised land. And you had the episode of the 10 plagues that Pharaoh said, okay, you can go, and then no, I changed my mind, and God would send another plague, and then he said, okay, you can go, and then he changes his mind again, and until the plague of death, where the firstborn male, both animal and human, were taken in death during the night, and the angel of death passed over the Israelite people, and they celebrate that to this day with the Passover feast, remembering what God did when that plague came to the people in Egypt. And so the Pharaoh has agreed to let the people go. They have left the area that they were living and headed out into the wilderness. And then Pharaoh once again decides, no, I've changed my mind, and is chasing after the Israelite people. He's assembled his army to go and to forcibly bring the people back. And Moses has led the people at God's direction. You remember that during the day they have the pillar of smoke before them, and during the night they have the fire, so that they can see that God is there and God is in front of them, and they're following that. And God has led them out to the area of what we know today as the Red Sea. It was known as the Reed Sea at that time. I'm not sure about this, but it has always seemed to me that the area of the Red Sea that is thought to be where the Israelite people crossed over would be on the northern end of the sea, closest to land. And typically, in the area that I grew up in Maryland, around the Chesapeake Bay, the further north you go into the bay, when you get up into what's known as the Susquehanna Flats, it's where the Susquehanna River empties into the Chesapeake Bay. That area is much shallower than the rest of the bay, and there's a lot of when the water gets shallower, there tends to be the grasses and the reeds grow up in that area. So I don't know if that's a fact here or not, but that's when I see the Reed Sea, that's what I think about. And so there are a couple things that stood out to me in this story. In verse 14, let me pick up with the 13th verse. But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid, stand your ground and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. Just keep still. And Moses is telling the people, don't worry about this. God's got your back. But yet God's Well, in fact, God did have the back because God had moved that pillar of cloud and fire had moved from in front of the people to behind the people and was between the Egyptians and the Hebrew people. And so God had their back. But Moses is saying, be still, just keep still. In the very next verse, then the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to get moving. I've told you God had already made clear that they were to go out and cross over the sea. So there was an element of mistrust here. In verse 16, he says to Moses, as for you, lift your shepherd's rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and split it in two so the Israelites can go into the sea on dry ground. And so the next morning, that's what Moses does. Now, through the night, the scripture says that a strong east wind blew through the night, and that when the daybreak broke, that the sea was parted and the ground was dry and they could cross on over. A lot of people have speculated as to just what happened here. I remember one of the hurricanes that struck the Gulf Coast. This would have been in the late 80s, early 90s in that area. I can't remember the name of the hurricane, but it came in, and the eye of the hurricane came in, I believe, over the Pensacola Beach area. And as you know, the hurricanes rotate around in a clockwise manner. Counterclockwise. I got that backwards there. And so the wind would have been coming in over the area between Pensacola and I believe the next area over is Denton, in that panhandle area. And the wind would have come over and around, and then on the west side of the eye is the area around Mobile. And during this hurricane, this phenomena that we read about here occurred, that the winds that were blowing around blew the water out of Mobile Bay, and the northern part of the bay was dry. Well, actually, it was all mud there. And I remember talking to some people who had been there and said that as the winds died down, that people just flocked out there because they couldn't believe what they were seeing, that where there was water, there was just land. And they said every once in a while some of the mud would move and you'd realize there was a crocodile down there in the mud. So you didn't want to go stomping around down there. Point is that there is within nature a phenomenon that could be brought to bear that would create the situation that we read about here, that the waters could be pushed back and that they could cross over. And Scripture goes on to say that that after they had crossed over, that the Egyptian army decided they would follow them, figuring if they can do it, we can do it. And as they got into the area where the water was, that the wind quit blowing and the waters rushed back, and all of the Egyptian army was swallowed up into the sea there. There has been some modern archaeology that has found artifacts in the sea bottom of the Red Sea that lends some credence to this. There are chariot wheels that they have specifically, that they have found in an area of the sea bottom that they don't have any other explanation as to why those relics are there for that. The main thing I think that we take out of this is that, first off, God has our back no matter what situation we find ourselves in. if we are attempting to live in a right relationship with God, you can always count on God having your back. That's some of the theology that we have here. The other element of this that struck me when I was looking at it to prepare for this morning was in verse 15. Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to get moving. I think in our Methodist tradition, one of the things that we tend to do as Methodists is form a committee and study something to death, rather than actually doing something. And many times that divides the church. The issue of human sexuality is one that has been studied and debated for 40 some years, and we are very divided on that. I think God would say it's time to move on, rather than being bogged down. But so often we tend to want to figure something out in minute detail rather than trusting and moving forward. Here in our own congregation at Main Street Church, we spent, if I recall correctly, about 7 or 8 years studying and debating whether or not to renovate our old sanctuary or build a new sanctuary. And God very clearly showed us and told us to get moving and what we needed to do when the old sanctuary was condemned because it was almost ready to fall down. I always saw that as God said, "You've studied this enough, it's time to do something."
Well, that was in the plans back in the 60s when they built this education building, that the others would be torn down and a new sanctuary being built. But that was in the mid-60s when they made that decision. But the old guard wanted to keep the old buildings.
There was a companion decision along with that, Roger, that they had also said that they would not do anything until they had raised $100,000 that they had in hand. Now, it took them, this was before my time with the congregation, but it took them over 20 years to accumulate that $100,000, because as time moved on, the enthusiasm to move on into another building project after this building was built kind of faded away. And those that had the vision for that new sanctuary weren't as enthusiastic when the $100,000 was at hand. And that's what predicated the studying whether or not we need to spend the money for a new sanctuary or renovate the old one that we loved so very much. And as it turned out, renovating the old sanctuary was there was an inability to calculate the cost because of so many unknowns and what would be involved in restoring that building. So two takeaways. God's got our back, and we need to move on from time to time to be the people of God. Any other comments or thoughts as we wrap this up here?
Sometimes it's better to do it and ask for forgiveness later.
You get that a lot?
We had a district superintendent operated under that motto quite a bit.
Just do it and ask for forgiveness later.
Yeah. Plus, a lot of times, once it's done, it's harder to undo it. But I digress here. Well, as we look at this, as you think about this story again, one that we've learned, if you're like me, you learned this as a child in Sunday school and Bible school, and has been there with you all through the ages. Hope you'll think about it again, how it might impact you today. And be with us later on this morning as Pastor Dawn unpacks this in her new sermon series, Bridges, and we look at the crossing the Red Sea. May God's blessings be upon you.